Success Insight shares the stories of the people with passion and drive who make things happen in the world. Here's your host, Howard Fox.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to another edition of the Success Insight podcast. Our guest today is Ed Marohn. Ed was a captain in the U.S. Army. He was Airborne and Ranger trained, and he served in Vietnam with the 101st Airborne Division. He commanded a combat unit and was awarded 3 Bronze Stars and 1 Air Medal. Ed is retired as an executive from an international Fortune 500 company, and he was elected to a 4-year term. Why would you want to get into politics, Ed? I don't know. But Ed was elected to a 4-year term to the Idaho Falls City Council and has been an active volunteer VA facilitator for PTSD veterans. Ed is also the author of Legacy of War, a psychological thriller set against the backdrop of the Vietnam War. Ed, so much to talk about. Welcome to the Success Insight podcast.
Thank you, Howard. Appreciate it.
You've had quite the journey in life, going from the military service, quite an action-packed military service, soon to be best-selling author, I'm sure. But let's, if you can, share with our listening audience on the podcast a little bit more background and context to who you are and how you got started along this journey to become a writer.
Well, it goes back, I think, when I was on active duty, I had some articles published, got paid for it. There are nonfiction articles about brainwashing, and that enticed me that maybe I could write. If nothing else, it was good for my career development, the 10 years I served in the Army. But in any case, when I left the Army, resigned my commission, I went into the corporate world with the, as you mentioned, the international Fortune 500 tire companies like Michelin and Continental Tires. So I became a director and executive with those companies. And as I traveled, one of my desires was one of these days I would like to write a book. It's one of those things, maybe a bucket list, but there was more to it than that. It was a driving passion. And lo and behold, I ended up doing my PTSD counseling with vets in the eastern Idaho area. The VA is very, at the time when I did this, started in 2008 after I retired from the corporate world, VA was very limited in reaching out to rural areas throughout the U.S. to get groups formed. And so they would ask former combat vets, officers like myself, to help facilitate a post-traumatic stress disorder group therapy session. And since I served in combat and have a little exposure to psychology, I decided I would volunteer my time. And that was probably the catalyst for getting into writing a book. And I wanted to write a novel, and I didn't want to write another war book. The novel occurs in modern day, present day, 2002 and on, after the war had long ended. And the idea was to tie in the impact to all participants on both sides of warfare, their impact or how they were impacted by war. And of course, I dealt with the emotional trauma of the war demons, so to speak, of the killing fields of Vietnam, the jungles, and so on. And that's how I developed my character, John Moore. He wanted to go in that direction. But that's how it all started. And it took about 10 years to write it. I started in 2009 after I went back to Vietnam to see the country.
That's actually something I wanted to chat with you about, because I had read you had gone back there with your wife for a visit. Did that desire to go back there, was it a kind of a growing desire? And was there this aha moment when you were over there? I need all this interest that's been sitting dormant for a while, and now you're here, you're back, and probably a lot of memories, I would imagine, are coming and bubbling up to the surface. Is that how the book started to take shape for you?
You're very perceptive, Howard. That was pretty much it. The PTSD group I started was in 2008. So within a year, the catalyst was formed in my mind. I had to go back to Vietnam. I had to see what was going on in a country that I fought for a full year. Where the interesting part of this book and my exposure to why I wrote it was I flew into Hanoi. Well, Hanoi was north of the DMZ, and we bombing it constantly while I was in Vietnam. So I thought, this is a weird situation. Instead of going to Saigon or Da Nang right away where I served, I thought, well, wait a minute, this is very interesting. How are they going to accept me? Because remember, Hanoi is the same place in that lake where John McCain crashed his jet after he got shot down. And one of the tourist attraction that my guide gave me was we drove right by that little lake in the downtown area. And she pointed out and said, that's where your John McCain crashed. To them, that was the highlight. And what was interesting to me, my first initial reaction was, how would they accept me? How would they look at me? Because we're in North Vietnam, technically, the old North Vietnam, where the enemy that we fought coming across the DMZ. And I'm thinking, how would they accept this tall American? Because the average Vietnamese is about 5'4", and I'm almost 6 foot and different color skins. And I stick out like a sore thumb. So in relationships, so I'm thinking, what are they going to think? What is an American doing in country? And all these ideas gel, and that's some of what goes on in the book.
What I find is interesting. So this is 2008 timeframe, 2009.
2009, right.
The war ended in, I should know my history, but mid-70s, 75. So you're good 25, 35 years-ish.
Yeah.
How much of what will they think of me was a story you made up versus what reality was?
The reality, in fiction writing, you take the liberty of taking facts and obviously honing them to your whatever you're trying to say in your book. Very close to reality, very close to reality. John Moore, for example, my main guy, my character, his first reaction was trying to respond to the stares of the Socialist Republic of Vietnam Army and police that he's working with. See, this is a switch. He goes there to help out and try to solve a war crime. And he's been pushed into it by the CIA for their own reasons. And the Socialist Republic of Vietnam wants him because he has a degree of respect by this Colonel Tin, all the characters I'm playing with. But when he's there, he actually, and what I saw was there were stares until they got to know you. This American, why is he here? He's part of the reason I lost a father or I lost a brother in the war. And remember, the Vietnamese, North Vietnamese particularly, were fighting the war. An average tour for these guys wasn't a year. They were about 10 years. They would come across the DMZ through the A Shaw Valley, and they would stay in the southern part of Vietnam fighting. They didn't have an airplane ride or a bus or anything take them back on the weekends. They were there for almost the duration. So they had really a harsh life, and their family life was disrupted. That some didn't ever see their kids born because they died over there or in the South. And so anyway, all these emotions. There's a story where when I'm talking to somebody from the South Vietnamese side, when we cross over to Da Nang and who were South Vietnamese, the guy told me, hey, one of the things that we're suffering from because we're labeled as supporters of the Americans and South Vietnamese government, we have to wait 3 generations before we can get a job for the government, for the military, for the police. That's their punishment by the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. So you get different perceptions or stories from both sides.
Well, one thing that surprised me and what you've just shared is, and I have a good friend of mine, let me just create a little more context, who's very active in Veterans Affairs. Her 2 brothers were in active duty and served in Vietnam. One of them did suffer. They probably both suffered, one perhaps a little more than the other, from the post-traumatic stress disorder. And they have gone back to Vietnam to visit and do the the self-healing, the catharsis, and just try to kind of make sense of everything they've gone through. And what I hear is how hospitable the Vietnamese people were. Now, they didn't distinguish between folks that lived above that demarcation between the North and the South. So I was actually a little surprised that kind of why I asked this question is I was wondering whether you were getting looked at strangely until they got to know you. Was that more just a story you made up for yourself about yourself? Now, maybe, in the story, you get to take a lot more liberties, but were they just more hospitable? And maybe it was just something you were making up. But what you're saying, though, it was kind of reality.
Yeah, I mean, I'll be honest, I may have or would have probably exaggerated initially because my character Moore, he's suffering from memories of the war.
Sure.
And so he may be defensive as he's looking at the former. I wanted to create a little bit of conflict. It wasn't like, here's my character coming in, or here's Ed Marohn arriving in Vietnam with open hands. One thing you can say about the Vietnamese, no matter where they are, South, now it's one country finally, they're all very stoic. They've lived with war for close to 2,000 years. They beat the Chinese, the Mongols, the Huns, any group that wanted to invade South or Vietnam, they got really pretty much kicked out. I go back to the story after we ended the war in 75. Around 79, the Chinese decided that they wanted to take over some of the provinces north or south along their border with the northern part of Vietnam. And the Vietnamese army kicked I won't say the dirty word, but they kicked them back. And you don't want to attack Vietnam. They've been fighting for so long that they have a very efficient military. And they know what they're doing. So the Chinese have been, we just send troops across and occupy it. So, yes, to be honest, there were stares. And was it more like, this is just another American here or another Aussie? It's a great tourist place. The Australians, the Germans, the French, they go there. It's a very economic vacation. But there were stares that once I got to talking to the guys that served or had fathers that served, once they realize you're human like anybody else and they understand you, you understand them, those stares go away if they're in a group. But I think the Vietnamese are very accepting of foreigners in their country because they've been occupied for so long that they don't have a big hang up, but they certainly would have some views and biases against people coming in. And I use that to create the conflict. When you have plots in a novel, you have multiple subplots and you need to create the conflicts and so on. So for Moore, I had to create a little more tension than I really experienced, but there was some. Because when I'm talking to our guide, who ends up in my book as well, she tells me that her father died, her father died, or her stepfather, father-in-law. I got to get it. There's so many relatives that I dealt with. But anyway, her father-in-law died fighting the Americans in South Vietnam. Everybody's got connections of death or wounded from the war. It's very much part of their makeup. So when she's telling me that, I'm sitting back in the car with my wife and I'm thinking, I wonder how tense is going to be going forward. But as soon as she told me, it's all business. She's our guide and she's going to make us feel comfortable and we're going to enjoy the tour. And that to me was really a great feeling to have her go away from the war, which really impacted them.
Sure. Now, in Legacy of War, I saw it's described as a psychological thriller. Where does that lens come into the book? I mean, it's not your typical, as you had said earlier, it's not your typical look back at the Vietnam War. Here's my war story. I mean, I've had Diane Klutz was a nurse in the war in Vietnam. Okay. This is a work of fiction. It's not your typical war story. Where does the aspect of the psychological thriller come in?
Well, it comes to the point where initially more deals with his PTSD patient, which helps trigger all these events that force him eventually to return back to Vietnam. And when he's doing the therapy, and Moore is the psychologist in the book, when he's doing the therapy with his PTSD patient, this guy reveals certain things that were committed in Vietnam, which were war crimes. And then he kills himself the next day after the therapy session. So all these create the emotional concept. But where the psychological thriller comes into play, and I don't want to give away the plot.
We won't do that.
No. But towards the end, it's revealed why he was dragged into this. And it's one of those things where I just kind of rolled into that. And I used the Asian mentality versus the Western culture mentality, the yin and yang of life, and how people feel they can do certain things because they're doing it for the right reason, but it's part of their philosophy. So I throw in all that, and that's where the psychological stuff comes into play. Up until then, it's a very fast-moving action adventure. And so at the end, Moore finds out, finally, face-to-face, why he had to be there.
Gotcha. Well, I do want to share, and I'm very happy to see, Kindles are my friend. Obviously, we want a paperback. Some people want that paperback in our hand. I actually love having the paperback, but I also recognize I'm a kind of a bookaholic, and doing this podcast, I get to meet a lot of fascinating authors. And I will say, this book of yours is it's definitely on my list, and I will accomplish that reading of it over the holidays. And so all the research of going into the book was just kind of learning more about you and getting prepared for this. I'm curious about the writing process. You, at the early stages of our podcast, you had done writing nonfiction work and written about brainwashing of sorts. You kind of working within the veterans community as a counselor and working with the PTSD vets. And so the book took you approximately 10 years to write. What were the challenges of this aha moment? You and your wife were in Vietnam. Now, okay, I'm ready to write this book. There's a book in me. I'm going to sit down and do it. What was the process you went through to create this book? And what were some of the challenges that you had in getting this story told?
Well, I think part of it was to make it appealing to the reader, because I think readers get tired of reading about more war books or more war stories, although there's a place for it and there's certainly a strong audience for that. But I wanted to create a novel that is kind of contemporary. And the key was to balance the plots with a few flashbacks. I probably have 4 or 5 flashbacks in the book where Moore reveals what happened during a war, why he sometimes gets a little bit emotional or upset, maybe semi-depressed. So that was the key, was not to overburden with the flashbacks, what happened and so on. And the trick, or I hope the skill set, was to try to blend it in and tie it into the culture he's in. The other part was, of course, trying to ensure that I related to the historical aspect of Vietnam, because I tie in culture of Vietnam. I had to, when I was there in 2009, we went there at the end of January, intentionally so, because that's when they celebrate the Vietnamese New Year, which is called Tet, which is similar to the Chinese New Year. And there's a 2 or 3 day span at the end of January, overlapping to February, where the Vietnamese from all over the world, wherever they are, they converge on Vietnam and within country to their villages, to their parents or whatever, and they celebrate the Chinese New Year. And so I had to ensure that I was really accurate in that, because from my war memory, I didn't participate in the Tet New Year celebration. I was in the jungle, and I could care less about any there were no holidays. We had a ceasefire on Christmas Day, but that's about it. There were no Sundays. Whenever the chaplain flew out, could be a Wednesday. That was Sunday for us if we would do any prayer prayer work. So anyway, that was important to tie in. And so I did a little bit more research on Ted, and I got to know actually got more insight into the Vietnamese culture, which I blend into the book. That all took time. And so it's not just a simple matter of John Moore running off to Vietnam to solve a crime. He gets involved with the people. And how do I create that emotion? How do I create that conflict? That took a lot. And so I tried to incorporate all these events that I saw happen during TAT and try to tie it into the book. Also tried to incorporate the culture of the family life, because Moore sits and eats dinner with his partner, the Vietnamese national police agent, who's married to and who's a professor, and they've got 3 kids, 3 boys who are rowdy, and he's over there in their little apartment eating a Vietnamese meal. And so all this was planned, but it took time to get set up. And of course, I had multiple versions. I had to do some beta testing with friends and family and strangers to test out the book to see if the reality was there. I didn't want to write a novel that was a fantasy. I mean, this is a fiction based on some historical events, but mostly on contemporary events, and trying to make that appealing. But at the same time, I didn't want to bog down into philosophies, anti-war or pro-war. That's not what this is about. I wanted the reader to decide for him or herself if what the Americans did or what the North Vietnamese did was right or wrong. It wasn't for Moore to pass on, other than the fact that he suffered a little bit. And so I wanted to really build that drama for Moore, that he saw a lot of death. He saw his men die. And when he thinks about the War Memorial in Washington, D.C., he knows where to find the names about those guys and that died under his command. So it's a complicated process, but it was fun. And I think at the end, what I really enjoyed the most was the editing of the book, where I would go back and do reality checks, not just for grammar and all those things, but to make sure my plot lines, the timelines were accurate, that it was a realistic story. Because readers are very good at picking out weaknesses, saying, this doesn't even make sense. And I didn't want the reader to go down that way with my book.
Excellent. And I'm curious then, if in order to assist you, aid you in the continuity and the timeline and the accuracy, you mentioned bringing others into your writing process. So, I mean, there's the family who want nothing but the best for us. And yeah, this is great, et cetera, et cetera. And I'm sure that happened. Did you involve or invite others who had lived through the similar experience that you had to participate, become some of the beta group that was helping you to write the book?
Yes, I did invite some former vets, not just from Vietnam, but from other wars, to do a reality check. And I also did a lot of research. This is funny because when I came back from Vietnam, that was 1970 timeframe, the war was officially over in 73 by treaty, but we were still in there, at least the U.S. Embassy and some Marines, till 75 when the embassy was evacuated. But where I was going with this, what I saw happen at the end of the war was that we didn't know the history. When I was in the jungle, I had no concept other than I was a commissioned officer in the United States Army, sworn to do my duty for the country and so on. And I had to accept what I was told. Now, if I'd gone over there with any real historical study, I may have been more critical of what I was doing. But I was over there and I was doing my duty. It's when I got back that I started doing some, like in the 80s and the 90s, I started doing a lot of research and reading almost every book I could find, because I was there and it was interesting to do a fact check with what I saw, with what the authors that wrote nonfiction books about the war, historical books. And there's a ton of them. I even went back all the way to when the French occupied Vietnam and when they lost in 1954 at Dien Bien Phu, and where the North Vietnamese kicked them out by defeating them solidly. So I learned a lot about the history of the Vietnamese, and that was important for me, keeping that in the back of my mind as I wrote, because then I had the historical database in my mind, and I tried to add that or make that a part of the book so that Moore isn't just making up things as he's going through life.
Gotcha. Now, with Legacy of War, I mean, it's been out for probably about half a year now, came out in July of this year.
Right.
You're presently writing part 2. Is this is a continuation of the story without giving anything away? Can you share a little bit about what is at least the intent? Your intent can change tomorrow, but what, as of right now, what do you think? What's happening in the next writing project for you?
Well, it's going to be a follow-up to Legacy War. I want to also have a unique title. So any ideas from you, Howard, I'd appreciate it. I'll give you my notes.
All right.
One of the things that happened, the people who read the book came back to me and said, I want to know more. What happened with John and Sally, which is his associate in his psychology firm that he created? And so I didn't think about that. I intentionally left some things up for grabs towards the end, just in case. And doggone it, these readers are shrewd. They picked up on it, and they're good. So they wanted to, what will Moore do now? What happened to his romantic involvement with Sally? And on and on and on. So I've got to follow up on that and finish it up. And of course, there's the missing file about a certain
Don't give anything away now, Ed.
No, I'm not going to see. And so there's that, and I left that intentionally because Moore's the type of guy that to me, he's a hero. He struggles, but he has ethics and standards, and he doesn't violate the law or what he's sworn to uphold. He adheres to those standards. And so when this thing about the file came up, he did what he thought was the right thing, never read it, ignored it, and left it hidden in Vietnam. So there's that part that will have to come to fruition in the following novel.
Fantastic. So, Ed, if our listeners would like to learn more about you and the book, where are the places that you would like to invite them to visit so they can do that?
My website is writingsfromed.com, and it has my bio and all the book I wrote, plus all my articles. I just recently got published in Idaho Magazine, wrote a creative nonfiction piece that is entertaining, so everybody says. You can buy the book either through my publisher, Book Baby, or you go to Amazon.com, both as you like, Kindle or Nook or any of the. You can buy an ebook or a print book off of Amazon. You can go to Barnes & Noble, do the same on Nook for ebook or a print book. And really, I'm tied in with all the independent bookstores nationwide through my distributors from Book Baby. So if you go to one of their sites, whatever independent bookstore you like, you'll see my book there. It may not be in stock at that moment, but you can order it within days. They will have it. It's readily available, and Reader's Favorite gave me a 5-star review about the book. There's another site you can go to, Reader's Favorite, Goodreads. If you're a heavy reader, Goodreads, probably you're already a member of that, and the books there are listed, and I'm on there as an author, so you can see what Ed Marohn likes to read. I'm very eclectic. I go from fiction and nonfiction all over the place.
Fantastic. Well, we will most definitely provide links back to some of your sites, obviously the website, Amazon, and the Reader's Favorite. You got the 5-star award there. We'll provide the link back there as well. And really looking forward to sharing your book and this podcast with our listeners. And I've got my friends that I was alluding to earlier who are very much interested in the Vietnam War and the legacy of the war. And so the book title is perfect, Legacy of War. And so I know they're going to be interested in it as well. And before we head out at it, just I'm curious, when you're not sitting in that nice office, you're in a beautiful state of Idaho, what are you doing when you're not sitting in front of that Apple computer over your shoulder? What do you like to do?
Well, some of my favorite pastimes when the weather's nice. Right now I have snow on the ground. I do like to go do downhill skiing. I go up near the Tetons, a place called Targhee. Little plug for them. It's a great ski resort, minimum 10,000 feet. So it's great elevation. I like when I get a chance to do some hiking and biking, but summer times or fall, spring, golfing has become a passion for me. Not that I'm a good golfer, but I do enjoy it. And one of the things I learned when I was on a city council for Idaho Falls, we have 3 municipal golf courses that are fantastic. And when I lived in Charlotte and Chicago, the golf fees were high. And I don't know if you golf, but you're from Chicago. It's not cheap. But boy, living in Idaho, at least in Idaho Falls, great golf courses and inexpensive. So, you can spend all day out there and just have a ball.
Fantastic. Well, you're in a beautiful state and staying healthy, you can't help but do that. Just get out there and take advantage of it. Ed, thank you again for joining us on the podcast. I hope you enjoyed yourself. And I am definitely looking forward to, over the next couple of weeks, I've got one book that's actually, I just started. I've got one. It's in queue, and yours is the second one in queue. So I'm taking it. I'm going to take advantage of this, and that's actually one of the best parts about the podcast is I have had the opportunity to read some pretty cool books, and I actually am, as a coach, involved in leadership development and training. I read a lot of nonfiction books, and I have to be honest with you, it was nice to really sit down and read some works of fiction and not have to worry about, is this tied to a project or a client, or am I doing this for a reason other than just to enjoy myself? So I'm looking forward to reading Legacy of War, and we'll get out to Amazon and increase those reviews. And as I understand too, you've got some book signings coming up. So that's always good fun, and take advantage of those. Those are great.
Yeah, they're worth it. Well, it's part of marketing. When you get out there, people like to buy from, like in Barnes & Noble. I'm doing a book signing tomorrow, but part of it is just me sitting there and trying to promote my book, which is in stock, And so I wanted to show Barnes & Noble, at least locally, they're not wasting their time with me. And we've had good success in the area. So they keep stocking the book, and I have to keep coming back.
That's a good problem to have, as they say. I would love if you could share perhaps the cover of the book with us, and maybe if you take some pictures while you're at the Barnes & Noble tomorrow, the book signing. Let's get a couple pictures of you at the book signing,
Sure.
Signing books, right sitting behind the table with that stack of books in front of you. We'll put those up on the show notes as well on the website.
Okay.
So, Ed, it's been great to chat with you, get to know you and about your background and your work. And really, we wish you much success with Legacy of War and your future success with whatever the next book is going to be titled. And perhaps we'll do some crowdsource book naming for you and see what we can come up with, okay?
You got to have something really catchy.
There you go. And we'll come up with that. So thank you again for joining us. It's been a pleasure to chat with you today.
Thank you very much, Howard. I really enjoyed it. Appreciate you.
There you have it, folks. We have just been chatting with Ed Marohn. He is a former officer in the U.S. Army. He has been an executive for Fortune 500 companies. He's been an elected official in the local city council, volunteer facilitator for PTSD veterans, and he is the author of Legacy of War, a psychological thriller set against the backdrop of the Vietnam War. Go out there, whether it's on Amazon, go to Ed's website, Writings from Ed, and Reader's Favorite, and we'll provide links to all of those. But this is a nice book, good work of fiction, and Ed went into creating this book. It's not just your typical shoot 'em up, Jason Bourne kind of thriller. So there's a lot going on here. So take advantage of it. And of course, again, we'll provide the backlinks on our show notes. So wherever you are, whatever you're doing, go out there, have a phenomenal day, and we'll see you on the next episode of the Success Insight Podcast. Take care now.
Success Insight is a production of Fox Coaching and First Story Strategies. Find us online, successinsightpodcast.com.